Thank you for having me here. These are my disclosure. I have the same disclosure as one of the former speakers. I'm not an interventional cardiologist. I'm a cardiac intensivist, so the last 45 minutes I've been mortified that somebody would ask me a question how I would manage that case, which would have been really embarrassing for me. So I'm going to talk about something I know a little bit more about, which is cardiogenic shock. And of course, it starts in AMI shock with the occluded coronary artery. But what really triggers all the disaster that's happening after that is that the cardiac output decreases to a critical point where the body is not supported with enough oxygen. And then all of these disasters happen. And if we don't interrupt that, the patient will most likely die. Given this, it's kind of intuitive that mechanical circulatory support could be beneficial. We have to realize that these patients come in very different phenotypes as well. So there's the LV predominant phenotype, which is a large myocardial infarction with extensive loss of contractility, and these patients usually have more than one diseased vessel, or it's a left main problem. And the predominant way of dying for these patients is from refractory shock. The other phenotype is the cardiac arrest phenotype, which is very different from this. In that case, there's a sudden loss of circulation. When circulation is restored, the heart recovers faster than in the LV predominant shock form, and the main mode of death in the cardiac arrest patient is from anoxic or hypoxic brain injury. So what are the evidence to treat these different phenotypes? So this is the ECLS shock trial that most of you are familiar with. 417 patients were randomized. Inclusion criteria was a lactate more than 3 and a systolic blood pressure of less than 90. And it was allowed to be resuscitated for up to 45 minutes in the trial. It was a large multi-center trial. 44 sites was enrolling patients, and they ended up with 78% cardiac arrest in this study. And I think that surprised Holger Thiele and the study group that it was such a high rate of cardiac arrest. Likely it was the high lactate level, I would guess, that drove this high rate of cardiac arrest. Most other trials and registries have 40 to 50% cardiac arrest in this type of population. But a very sick population, lactate was very high. Blood pressure wasn't that low, which means that some of these patients were probably responsive to vasopressors. As you know, there was no difference in 30-day mortality. There's no difference in 1-year mortality, and there was an excess of complications. The IMPRESS trial in 48 patients compared balloon pump to Impella CP. It was also a cardiac arrest trial, really. 100% of the Impella patients and 83% of the balloon pump patient had suffered cardiac arrest. And in this scenario, the mechanical circulatory support did no benefit. In our practice, we don't see that many cardiac arrest patients need mechanical circulatory support. So this is data from the BOX trial where we in Copenhagen and Odense randomized almost 800 patients with cardiac arrest. We had a 2x2 factorial design. The main intervention was a blood pressure intervention that we published a few years ago. But in that population of 800 patients, about 40% would have been eligible for ECLS shock trial. And we used mechanical circulatory support in less than 1% of these patients. and they actually had a pretty favorable 1-year outcome with a mortality of 37%, which is not too bad for a cardiac arrest population. So when we designed Danger Shock many years ago, we really wanted to target this LV predominant shock phenotype. And we did that by targeting patients with a high lactate as a sign of hyperperfusion, low blood pressure. But then we excluded comatose cardiac arrest, which made the study a lot harder to do. We didn't really realize when we designed it how much harder, but more than 50, like for enrolling these 360 patients with AMI shock, we excluded 450 patients with cardiac arrest. So doing this, we made it tough, but I still think it was the right choice to do. Patient could have arrested, but they just had to regain consciousness, and then they could be randomized. We only had 14 sites, and for the first 5 years, we only had really 3 active sites, and it took us 5 years before we got funding to be able to expand to Germany and the UK, and we never really came close to the 44 centers that they had in ECLS shock, which is also a reason why it took us so long to enroll these patients. 20% had some cardiac arrest before randomizations. There was a lot of multivessel disease. The lactate was quite high, and blood pressure was a lot lower in our population than in the ECLS shock population. We had very little crossover, which is a strength of the study. We met the primary endpoint just barely. We heard about the fragility index. It was 4, which means that if 4 patients had crossed or had different outcomes, we would have had a neutral trial. But still, it's a pretty powerful signal, I think, in such a small population. But it is, of course, fragile. And we did see a lot more complications with these devices. We collected, or we went together with Holger Thiele's team and did this meta-analysis and tried to find patients in the other MCS trials that looked like the Danger Shock patients, and with a larger sample, we still had a significant sign of benefit in these highly selected patients. This has been hugely discussed since the publication. There's been so many discussion, and even just now there's a paper coming out in JACC Heart Failure that only deals with Danger Shock and all the things we did wrong and the things we did right. And it's just incredible how much focus it has gained. I'm just going to touch about a few subgroups. This is not a study of pre-PCI versus post-PCI. We randomized when we saw shock, so it could be before or after PCI. We did not see any interaction with the timing to the effect of the device. But we saw an interaction that if the time delay from onset of symptoms to the patient was randomized was more than 12 hours, there seemed to be less effect of the device. The other thing that has been discussed a lot was the fact that it looked like there was no effect in women in the study. I discussed it quite a lot with Roxana at ACC, where we presented the data, what the cause of this was. And at that time, I thought it was women are smaller, they have smaller groin vessels, smaller hearts. It's more difficult to have the device running well there. This was completely wrong. What was the reason for this was that women are 10 years older than men when they get their AMI shock. And really importantly, they come much later with their shock before they are admitted. So the time delay from onset of symptoms until randomization was more than twice as high or twice as long in women as in men. And this really, to me, explain, given the data we have looked at with age and time delay, that was the reason why it looked like women had no benefit. And if we look at women in the study of less than 77 years, we see the same signal of benefit of the device. So I don't think it's a sex difference in the treatment effect. I think it's the phenotype of women and men, the way they present with shock, that is different. This is a PCI meeting, so I want to share a little bit data from the PCI results of the study. So there was a lot of multivessel disease, and curiously, there was almost 50% or 47% of the patients in the study had multivessel PCI at the index procedure. So it was not staged PCI, it was at the immediate revascularization. These data were just presented at EuroPCR, and opposed to the culprit shock trial, where it was, as you obviously know, was more complications and higher death with multivessel revascularization. We kind of saw the opposite signal in our study. This is, of course, hugely biased data, because you would likely not mess around in a lot of vessels if the patient was in really severe distress in front of you. But it is an interesting signal that kind of challenges the culprit shock trial a little bit. What was really curious was how little it changed the culprit shock. So this slide shows how often there was multivessel PCI in the patients before and after culprit shock, and there was no difference. It didn't change the behavior of the PCI operators, and interestingly, it was identical in Denmark and Germany. So it was not that the Germans followed. This is what people did. There was nobody did CTOs or rotablation in these patients. So lastly, we should not forget that this always comes at a price. When we put these devices in, it cannot be without a price. So there's a downside to mechanical circulatory support, and we saw that very clearly in Danger Shock. So this slide just shows how much the rate of complication increases with the complexity of mechanical circulatory support, with Ecmella patients having 64% BARC 3 to 5 bleedings, 75% were on renal replacement therapy, and 11% had limb ischemia. So when we use these devices, we should really use them wisely. And that's why kind of the way I envision this, and we did this paper together with a lot of good colleagues in Europe and David Morrow from Boston, is that when we evaluate these patients upfront, decide whether or not the patient is an MCS candidate. And then is it comatose cardiac arrest? If it's not, it's reasonable to go the Danger Shock way, you could say. But if there's an RV failure or an oxygenation failure, you should go for an ECMO. If it's not, it can be reasonable to use an impeller. If it is cardiac arrest, be more patient, revascularize, optimize the hemodynamics. And if that is working, you should just continue what you're doing. If it's not working, evaluate cardiac output before the patient is put on these devices. And I think it matches pretty well with the guidelines that were discussed earlier today. And with that, I thank you for your attention.